Have you ever wondered why opera is only for rich people? I thought about that too, but then I started watching HBO's The Gilded Age, and I am in love with the opera war that's happening between the Metropolitan Opera and the Academy of Music in 1883. In today's video, we're gonna jump into all that jazz. Hi, Cassandra here with Opera for Black Folks, and on this channel, I break down the classical arts and opera from a Jamaican American perspective. Let's jump in. All right, so why is opera only for rich people? Well, the short answer is because an aristocrat in Europe where opera was birthed, in Italy and France at the time, it was very fashionable that every aristocrat would have their own court composer and their own court orchestra that was readily available whenever the aristocrat, man or woman, wanted to host fashionable society. And so you needed music, just like when you have people come over and you're like, oh my gosh, we need some music because we're having a party.
Wow, your house is really nice.
These things would go on for hours. You know, people would come at 6, 7, and then they would be entertained through the evening and probably wouldn't stop to eat dinner until midnight, 1 a.m. And so that kept musicians employed, it kept dancers employed, it kept singers employed. But that was from the 13th century to the 18th century. So when the end of the 17th century into the 18th century, it was no longer fashionable to have your own orchestra and your own composer. Because music was changing, people's desires were changing, there were more opera houses. Because opera was so popular, it was the popular music of the time, there were opera houses in every major city, so you could just go to the opera, which also was for the social elite, because it wasn't like the people who were impoverished had enough money to, or even the regalia, to go and attend an opera, even though it was the popular music at the time. And so the reason that the Gilded Age is considered gilded is because there was such disparities in wealth. It was the opposition of extreme wealth against extreme poverty, and how there was no balance of the two. And so I love that we're getting this historical reference to those imbalances, even though I'm like living for it. I'm like, girl, you see, yes, queen. Okay, so in the Gilded Age, we have a couple of historical characters of the elite that was determined by Miss Caroline Shimmerhorn Astor and her time with Ward McAllister, another historical character, were attempting to codify the social elite. So they were mimicking what the British were doing, but they were also inspired by the French fashions at the time. You know, we're still inspired by the French and their fashion. It's wonderful. And then the Italians also have their influence because opera is coming out of Italy. The Americans were trying to decide, how are we going to make this our own? And opera is in that because you need entertainment. You need people to entertain you while you're having these lavish parties with your socially amazing friends. From Caroline Astor's standpoint, people who had proper behavior and etiquette, the right birth line, and you had to have the right amount of money. They were determining who was allowed to be a part of that. And within the show, we see that there's a real dichotomy between the old money that has been there since the inception of America, and then the new money, people who are making money at the time during the Gilded Age. It's the industrial period, and people are self-made millionaires. They came from nothing and they made something of themselves. The new wanted to come in and be a part of the old, and the old didn't want the new because, I don't know, it might remind them how old they are. I don't know. And so I love that we are seeing this play out in the Gilded Age. But it's also happening between the opera. So the Academy of Music, which was a place that existed, it was the precursor to the Metropolitan Opera. We have this wonderful character named Mariam Graves Anton Fish. She was an American socialite and a self-styled fun maker. She would have these elaborate parties. These parties were defined by Caroline Astor and Ward McAllister of who was a social elite. And Miss Fish was integral in this relationship because she was throwing these lavish parties which gave people excuses and reasons to go out, socialize, and basically meet their next husband or wife, because you're constantly commingling with the new young debutantes and the young men who are looking to either acquire more money based on who they marry or like make sure that they have the right name, right? It's like the whole thing that Caroline Astor and Ward McAllister were the puppet strings for, right? They were constantly navigating who was allowed to be a part of the society. And so Mariam Fish is famous for throwing these crazy parties. So for example, she's known for saying she was hosting this wonderful prince. She got everybody excited. She's like, I'm gonna have this prince, and everybody was so excited because they really get to show up and show out. They show up And the Prince del Dorego of Corsica turned out to be a monkey that was dressed up in princely regalia. But he was just for fun making that night. And so they're all drinking. They gave the monkey too much champagne, and then he got drunk and he's swinging from the chandeliers, throwing light bulbs at people, and I'm sure whatever else monkeys decide.
Swagger down the street with your red lips and funky beat. You better hold your head up to the sky. I'm gonna roll with you till the day I die.
That she ever had that party, Miss Fish. She's like, oh, no, I never did. But she was infamous for it. Or she had a wonderful party where she had a huge elephant in her home, standing there with dancers dancing around them and allowing the people to give the elephant peanuts. And they were having a whole raucous time, I'm sure. They were just drunk, basically playing with an elephant, you know? But it kept musicians employed, it kept artists and dancers employed, it kept composers employed. It was great, you know, drama and story that kept socialites coming back, and you were still socializing with people of your rank and file, so it was all fun. It was all fun. But if a person didn't want to have an extravagant party like Miss Fish did, but you still wanted to entertain, the way that shows would be put on in the opera was that an aristocrat would say, I wish to put on a show. They would go to the academy and say, I'm going to pay for everything. I want this show, I'm going to pay this composer to put on this. I'll pay the musicians the production costs. And then when it's time to sell the tickets, I will sell them to the people who have purchased their box series. They've spent money, they're putting in their money in their investment to have their box that they pay for monthly or whatever. So that helps to offset the ticket sales, but those ticket sales were extravagant and outrageous, and it was meant to be that way so that it left people out. So let's talk about the opera war between the Academy of Music and the Metropolitan Opera. They were at odds, and they did open on the same night historically, and it did create tension. It created tension between the old and the new. The old had access to the Academy. There was a long list of people that were wanting to be a part of the Academy, and once you were able to actually go and see an opera at the Academy and hold a box, like actually be a paid subscriber to that society, right? You knew that you were a part of the social elite. You had like essentially made it. You were acknowledged as a part of this group, and you had access to more resources or specific resources of the people and networks that you could cultivate and enjoy within that society. Now, the Metropolitan Opera came up because there was a desire to have more access to art. The new wanted to get into the Academy. They wanted to be a part of that experience. They wanted their children to be able to mingle with the old and have access to those resources, but it was clearly not accessible to them. The new Metropolitan Opera was coming up because it boasted a bigger space, a better theater, and even though the Metropolitan Opera that is at Lincoln Center today is not the Metropolitan Opera that was in competition with the Academy of Music, it was still a much larger space than what the Academy had. In the Gilded Age, there was a big gap between appreciating opera, specifically classical music, and if you were an everyday person, you appreciated music in a very different way, which is a time for another video, and it talks about folk song and art song. And opera has been supported since its inception by the rich people, and so it's not that it wasn't very popular in Europe, it was wildly popular. It was wildly popular all over. People were enjoying opera and were sensationalized by the composers of the day. They were the glitterati. So I think in America, the reason that opera has been for rich people is because they were the only ones to support it, and they held very tightly to it because it was to keep society separated, their society and their culture separated from everybody else. And so when all of that started to die away and the Gilded Age began to come to an end, it was very clear to the Metropolitan Opera that it couldn't rely on the social elite, especially like with COVID, with the pandemic, there was a redistribution of wealth. And so with that redistribution of wealth that was happening at the end of the Gilded Age, the same thing was true for opera, except now opera companies had to shift their audience because since the very beginning, It's always been to serve the social elite. And now it's about taking this thing that is really wonderful in its own right, because it's been wildly popular for hundreds of years, and now somehow catching up with the fact that it's been separated and regulated to only one cultural group. And so that's why I like this channel. I get to share the thing that I love and make it more accessible, because it is really wonderful when you go and see a live opera, like especially with it's like a comedy or a romance. It's wonderful. So again, tell me if you want to hear more stories about operas, so that when you go and see one eventually, you'll be prepped for what's coming. If you want a little insight about what it is to go to the opera for the first time, you can check out my video on first time in the Metropolitan Opera. So since the Met has made a lot of changes, and opera companies in general have made a lot of changes with the times, there's been a huge shift. In fact, there was a great study by the National Endowment of the Arts that realized that through the beginning of the 19th century and well into the 1980s, people were advertising about art, but the audiences weren't growing. And there was a study done from 1982 to 1996 to see why wasn't that being done? Like, how do we actually see how people are consuming art and music? And it was very interesting to see, at least at that time, as I was reading this study, that people who go to the opera are able to, and are usually the people that go and support other genres of art, because they're inspired by what they see within the opera. There's dance, there's music, there's literature, there's a story, there's drama, there's the symphonic element or the orchestra playing, and then there's the singing. So it inspires people to go and see dance. It inspires people to go and see art in different forms. They'll go and see musical theater, they'll go to the museums, they'll go to listen to a symphony play. They are more willing to enjoy other aspects, other kinds of art, because they're inspired by opera. And also, fun fact, that all people are able to appreciate art as long as they are exposed to it before the age of 18. If you are exposed to it thereafter, and I talk about this in another video that I'll reference right here or somewhere here, your brain is going to solidify its musical tastes once it gets to a certain age. And so when you're young and your brain is malleable, it's willing to take in all kinds of wonderful things for music and expand your cultural tastes. And because opera encompasses all of the visual arts and the performing arts, then it inspires appreciating art in all other areas, because you already got like a little snippet. It's basically like getting an appetizer. You get all the good things, so you get to try everything, and then that just inspires you to go, well, I really love that, so let me go get some more of that specific thing. Right? The NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, had to start thinking about, well, how are people actually digesting art, and why don't they choose opera? Why is that the one thing that seems to not be chosen all the time? And it's because I think historically it's really been only for the elite, and musical theater is super popular because that's really an American staple that essentially is opera. It's just like a lot of opera singers at the time were singing lots of great musical theater. It was easier to cross over because musicals are essentially operas. The difference is that the theaters are smaller and the orchestra is therefore smaller. The singers are mic'd for musical theater, whereas the opera singers are learning to project their own sound. Like, they're training to make sound themselves. You can check out my last video about that. It's essentially the same thing. It's people who are singing a story. That's a story that's been set to music that is accompanied by an orchestra, and that the singers are singing rather than speaking, although with American musicals, there's a lot more speaking than singing. And sometimes people think that the big stumbling block between musical theaters and operas is that musical theater is in English and operas are in all these different languages. And I go into how that is not a stumbling block in, going to the Metropolitan Opera for your first time, so check that video out. There's no reason to not appreciate opera. It's just that it's been really held tightly by the American elite and the aristocrats of our time over the past 400 years. And now we are in a century really where there isn't that influence so much. This is the 19th century was the first time we really didn't have that kind of hold over opera. So I think opera is going to have a chance to flourish and expand as long as we're talking about it and sharing it, and just encouraging people to go and enjoy it because it's great art. Why not? It makes you feel larger than life when you listen to it. And sometimes it's just really great to listen to something that expands you, right? All right, everybody, that's my share for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to let me know, what do you want to hear about with opera? What are some questions that you have? Are you interested in hearing more stories about opera? I'm happy to kind of delve into that. Please hit that lovely subscribe button So this is Opera for Black Folks, serving culture to all folks. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Ciao.